Our next speaker, Dr. Robert Chang, is actually a professor of English literature, but like good scholars everywhere, he's a kind of miner with a spelunker's cap and a pick and a shovel, and when he strikes an important and rich vein of material, he follows it. Well, he has found an important and rich vein of material in the records in the United States, largely naval records, about what happened in those years along the Pontic coast, and has created a number of important narratives and explanations of those events. His forthcoming book is The Genocide Against the Ottoman Greeks in the Naval War Diaries. And he'll be telling us more about that and more about his scholarship in the field. Dr. Shenk, please. As he's distributing his material, a personal note, when I was writing my book, he was extremely helpful, held my hand in a number of areas where I wasn't so knowledgeable, and corrected a few of my errors before they went to print, so I'm very grateful. And it's good to finally meet him.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you all for inviting me. Appreciate it very much. I'm handing out material about the book that I and Sam Kotzoglu of Chicago, if anybody knows Sam, or Savas Kotzoglu, have edited, and which will be published by the University of New Orleans Press, where I have just retired last week. It has to do with the series of American naval destroyers stationed in Samsun continuously from late spring of 1921 well into 1923. And the naval war diaries that the captains of these ships recorded what they were seeing and what they were hearing about events in Pontus, throughout Pontus, while they're in these positions. Sam found these documents in America's National Archives. He asked me to work with him to edit this material. His interest came because his family had suffered greatly, and his wife's family had suffered greatly, and that stimulated a long interest in Pontic history. He has followed that for a long time. Now, I pass those documents out. You'll see that they include the more or less the material about the book, which is coming out in this fall. But the second page is about Admiral James Stavridis, who has given us a foreword for the book, a very eminent man who reached the highest rank the Navy offers, full admiral. He was NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Europe for 4 years before he retired in 2013. He's the head of the head of the board of directors of the Naval Institute Press. His grandfather, an Ottoman Greek from Western Anatolia, got out of Smyrna in a small boat just before the Turks came in. His grandfather's brother was not so lucky, and he died at Smyrna. That's the second page, and I give you some information about what he said, and a little passage from the foreword. The third page is a photo of one of the destroyers that were stationed continuously. Each ship would come in for 3 weeks, and then another one would take over for over a year, beginning in late spring of 1921. Below that, you'll see a picture of one of these destroyer captains with some Greek bandits in the hills. That picture took place just after Smyrna in October of 1922. The occasion for this we do not know. The next pages include several diary accounts, diary pages from the book of war diary accounts. And you'll get a sense of what the book contains. Just for example, the first one includes in the offset material the one officer's conclusions as to what was going on that he was seeing at Samsun. A second one reports the burning of villages named Sinik and Tekakwe, which were destroyed, 250 villagers in the process. That's another one paragraph in that second page. The third page is the report of a swimmer who swam out to the American Navy vessels with reports of what was going on. He had escaped the desecration at Tekake, and he swam out to tell the Americans what was going on. The fourth page includes further information of the execution of Greek leaders at Amasia, which was reported and broadcast in the village, in the city of Samsun. Finally, that map on the last page shows you how many villages were around just, these are Greek, I believe, Greek and Turkish villages intermingled around Samsun. Well, if you see how many there are of those villages that's there, you can imagine how many villages there were throughout Pontus. There were hundreds of villages, and hundreds of them were destroyed by the Turks as one of the first things the Americans noticed was going on. That map came also from the war diary accounts in the Library of Congress. Okay, my background, a little bit of that. I'm an English PhD with a naval background. I'm a retired captain in the Naval Reserve. I fought on a destroyer and on river patrol boats. Spent a year of my life on river patrol boats in Vietnam. I also taught for 3 years at the Naval Academy. A friend and I were doing a biography of an Admiral Dan Gallery, who was famous for capturing a submarine on the high seas, the U-505, during the war. Well, Herb went into the stacks. You don't normally get into the stacks of an archive, but he knew the archivist very well. She let him go into the stacks, and he found there a stack of naval flight logs and steno pads. That seemed to be what they were until he came to the last four. The last four were Gallery's diaries about his early naval career. He and I read those, and I especially was interested in the fact that he was at Constantinople or Istanbul for 6 months there on a cruiser named USS Pittsburgh. So I became more and more interested in what was going on. Herb had his own project. I therefore went on and edited Gallery's diaries, but I began studying the period in much more detail. What Gallery noticed was going on there is it was great high life for the American officers and enlisted people in Constantinople. Great time. Russian princesses were everywhere, having been exiled, white Russians having been exiled from Russia. At the same time, the high life, and of course it was prohibition in the United States, but you could drink anything you wanted, and they did, anything you wanted at the time in Constantinople. At the same time, 2 or 4 hours steaming away, maybe 10 hours, you would go to a port, and many of the destroyers were in ports of Anatolia at the time, and find tragedies taking place. I looked further and further and found there were only a couple of articles about this, and no books had been written. I came across at one point Marjorie Dawkins' book, The Smyrna Affair. Corresponded with her, was invited to New York to visit with her, and she had in her book on the original book on Smyrna come across all sorts of American Navy materials, which told the story of what was happening there. So I also then searched into all sorts of other documents to find out what was happening. Eventually decided to write a book upon the topic, and so I wrote the book called America's Black Sea Fleet, which was published by the Naval Institute Press. Included in this book is a discussion of Admiral Bristol, who was favored the Turks and why. Also where the ships were, and they were in all parts of the Black Sea. They would settle down for 3 weeks in Novorossiysk or Odessa, and then eventually would visit Batum, and maybe for a few hours or a day would visit Trebizond, and then they would come for a 3-week visit to Samsun. There's a long chapter in Smyrna there, but it's been eclipsed by Lou's book and Marjorie's book before that. And then another chapter on what happened after Smyrna. And then, however, there was an early chapter which I called Death in the Pontus. Marjorie had devoted a couple of pages of her great book to the Pontic death marches. There were, at the time, you probably know this, but everyone in America had learned of the terrible things happening to the Armenians. Even myself, I remember that, and in the 1940s or 50s, I guess it was, my mother was telling me, eat my food because of the starving Armenians. As everybody had learned this once upon a time in the 20s as to what was happening, and so America made a great relief drive to Armenia to help those people out. So there were relief workers throughout Turkey, throughout Armenia, eastern Turkey, but also through every place where America had a mission station. Missionaries had been in Turkey since the 19th century, often had big complexes developed all throughout the interiors of Smyrna. So I found many records of these people at the Admiral Bristol collection in the Library of Congress. I searched out relatives, the people who had been on destroyers there, sons, nephews, daughters of naval officers who had been there, sent me letters about what the officers had seen. The officers, letters back and forth to their wives while they were on duty and away from them for a year, maybe, and so on. All sorts of material, and I did everything I could in writing this up. I wrote this chapter on death in the Pontus and sent it to some websites just for fun of Pontic groups. I didn't capture your website, didn't notice that, I guess. So, but I count, and so Sam, George Sherinian and others at Chicago invited me to speak at a conference on Greek, Armenian, Assyrian genocide. It happened in about 2012, 2013. Sam was there. Sam's parents, his wife's parents, had been caught up by those events. Family members had been killed. Sam's wife's father had been executed at Amasia. Sam's own father had barely escaped being killed in the destruction of the village of Ada, which is on that map near Samsun. The family ended up in Greece, and then somehow I haven't clarified exactly what happened. He and his wife ended up in America. He became an engineer and again kept an active interest in history, studied history, and was told by the late Dr. Somiadis, that the place he would find the records of American destroyers would be in the National Archives. I had seen a few of these, maybe a few days worth of records, maybe, I don't remember, maybe 10 days worth. Sam found 2,000 war diaries in the National Archives and photographed them all, and eventually he came up with a manuscript, and we worked, and I decided finally to help him out with this manuscript. I was really impressed by what he had found. In particular, we had to decide what of this the group of material to publish, and we decided on the Admiral Bristol had decided to send a continuous series of destroyers. That's a small but fairly powerful naval craft in that photos you've seen. They decided to station a continuous series of destroyers at Samsun. It was one of the closest places you could get to Angora, as it was called there. And so he sent these ships there, and so from the late spring of 1921, well into 1923, Americans had one or two destroyers right outside the harbor moored and anchored outside the harbor of Samsun. And the destroyer captain would get into the port every day, the particular destroyer captain who had been there. We decided to collect the material from 1928, spring of 1921 into 1922, about the time of Smyrna, when things changed radically. So what's in the book that's coming out in the fall? These are called war diaries. That was a official naval term. Basically, it's a naval genre. It's an official genre whereby an officer at some place or location or at sea would tell what's going on there. Okay? They were written by the destroyer captains, each one of who happened to be in that port, and then handed off the war diaries to the next fellow who had been in the port. They spent a little time at Trebizond, so we have a little bit of a collection of what was going on in Trebizond as well. They didn't spend continuous time there. They only spent a day or two there each month, something like that. How long are these war diaries? Each day's collection, each day's report may be as little as a paragraph, maybe up to 5 or 6 pages in length. We had to select them. What were they about? What the ship captain did when he went ashore, who he talked to, what he heard was going on his conversation with the local Turkish civil and military leaders, on his conversation with the local American businessmen, because there were 2 tobacco companies, American tobacco companies in Samsun, which had over 500 employees each. Greeks mainly, and then some Turks as well working for them. And these men, the managers, spoke Turkish, had been there for decades. And so the naval officer could spoke to them, and they were learning an awful lot from their own employees and from their ex-employees as to what was happening in the area. Beyond that, they talked to Near East relief workers, those who were in Samsun for a while, and then those who came back from the interior to Samsun and reported what was happening on the death marches and what was happening in Harput, in Sivas, in Marsovan, and so on. So, and then of course they were also talking to some other foreign nationals in the area, and assaulted by, occasionally assaulted by the Greek women who thought their lives was in danger, and even though they didn't speak English and Americans couldn't understand them, they were assaulted by that as well. What were they seeing or reporting? Greek villages everywhere were being destroyed. In a series of maybe a couple months at Samsun, almost every war diary reported seeing a new column of smoke in this direction, a new column of smoke in that direction. American captains were not allowed out of Samsun, but they heard from various sources, such as those as I've mentioned, what was going on, and they reported it in the war diaries. These Greek villages were being destroyed. Many of the villagers were being killed, raped, even in some cases burned alive. The men in the villages were typically marched off. We've heard about the labor work battalions, where there was so little food and so hard work at busting rocks for new roads and so on. No clothing, no shelter, no medicine. That a common estimate everybody admits was that the normal lifespan was 2 months. Okay, so all the villages were being destroyed and the people being taken off, and sometimes they were allowed to come into Samsun, but not very often. The ship would get the women and children. Suddenly, all the draft-age Greek men in Samsun were collected and marched off, 3,000 of them. There were some 3,000 male Greeks living in Samsun, usually working in businesses. After March, most of a day at a village called Kavak, half of them were massacred. Americans didn't learn this immediately. It trickles into the war diaries, but they did have testimonies from people who had gotten through that, somehow survived, and then described it. Who was doing this? Some of the death marches were conducted by actual Turkish soldiers or gendarmes sometimes. Here, this slaughter was carried out by mostly by paramilitary Cheta forces, bandits, ethnic laws, cutthroats under the leadership of the terrible Turkish leader Osman Aga. Well, not all of the men were killed. Many of them were marched further. Some of them escaped. Some ethnic Greek men joined resistance groups in the mountains. They lived in the mountains. They often took their families with them. They got food wherever they could from sympathetic villagers, as long as they were there. Most of the villages were eventually destroyed, and villagers marched off. Women and children who were left, they got food from some hunting. They got food from raiding Turkish villages. They got food from coming into Samsun and other places. They fought the Turks. Sometimes they were greatly feared by many Turks. As one of the ex-warriors, Greek bandits said, "We were killed and we killed in return." So much for some of the men who escaped. Most of the men, of course, did not escape. Then, throughout the region called Pontus, orders began being issued for the deportation of all the Greek women and children and old period people to the interior. The Americans heard about the orders. These orders were carried out in Ordu, Bafra, other towns, and these, again, reports were coming into the American Navy captains who were recording this in their diaries. Some were immediately killed. There were killings and rapes, and there was much death throughout the Pontus, especially later on in the death marches, again, much of which is recorded here. Again, where did the ship captains get all this information and about the local or distant atrocities that they record here? They get it sometimes from the tobacco managers who had former employees, Turkish employees, come to them and tell them what they had seen and heard of, sometimes with tears in their eyes, as to what had happened. They were so trusted, the American managers, that they told the story to them, and then they told that to the sea captains. Again, from foreign nationals, they learned a good deal. Also, people who had been in Turkey for years, spoke the language, and who also had their sources of information. Hold on a second. Thank you. Okay, what did the ship captains do about what they perceived was going on? And much of what we have here is a record of what was going on in Samsun for this whole period, which was all entirely under the nationalists, if you understand. It was 1921. It was entirely under the nationalists. And the people who were commanding these areas, a brutal Turkish general named Nureddin Pasha was in charge of the Central Army, and he was in fact pushing all the deportations. Well, the Americans protested what was happening to the Turkish civilian local officials, the Muhtasarif of Samsun, sort of the governor or the mayor of Samsun. They told their admirals Admiral Bristol in Constantinople, by message or by war diaries, what was going on. Yet the admiral himself was working at this point mostly for the Turks. He thought the Turks would be most helpful for the establishment of American business, and so he scoffed at the reports he heard of the terrible massacres and deportations. He hushed up what was reported to him and wouldn't let the American papers publish any of it. Reports about what he knew was going on. In one case, though, when the deportation of women and children was ordered at Samsun, a ship captain pleaded with the admiral so fervently and so rationally to protest the impending massacre, the death marches of the women and children in Samsun to Mustafa Kemal himself, not to protest locally, that wouldn't do it any good, but to him. And he convinced the admiral on this occasion. As a result, the Samsun death marches were called off. Moreover, they were called off permanently, and the one in Samsun proper, the death marches never were reordered, although everybody feared it greatly what was happening. So at that one moment, in that one occasion, the ship captain, drew all his rhetorical resources and his credibility with the admiral, because he had much naval credibility, not all of them did, to get the admiral to write. He wrote to Mustafa Kemal, and the Turks called out that deportation. However, in the rest of the Pontus, nothing was done. Even in the little villages right near Samsun, people would see the death marches being accumulated. All the women and children from all the areas right around Samsun were carried off. So, these war diaries tell what happened and what was going on there, what they saw. Okay? I'd like to make a few conclusions now. Early on, the ship captains, as we see in one of those diaries I showed you, were convinced that what they were seeing was a nationalist policy to exterminate the Greek minorities. They say this, that's said more than once in the war diaries. And this was simply very early on, before much of these particular death marches had shown what they had done. Much earlier than the Near East relief workers saw what was going on. That was a very early conclusion. You even find these mid-level American officers who were completely without a bias, had not run into this before completely. There was a special occasion. What do we do about what we're seeing? They conclude this. Of course, they report to the admiral what they say. In that handout I gave you, at the end of the page, I quote from the admiral's introduction of our book, Admiral Stavridis. These diaries are brief panoramas of events of a particular time and place that ended with the death of tens of thousands and the birth of a new nation in Turkey at a terrible cost, which has never been fully counted or acknowledged. An expert who read the manuscript says that this collection of war diaries provides a definite and strong counter-narrative to such a romantic view of Mustafa Kemal and the Turkish nationalist revolution. Thank you.
Will you take some questions?
Surely. Sir.
Yes, I have two questions. The first one, I'm not sure if I followed your full presentation of facts, but were there any instances whereby the U.S. Navy saved or actively participated in pulling out some of the victims or any other Pontiacs?
These officers were ordered to remain neutral. So this is a difficulty. You're ordered to remain neutral, and yet you see something like genocide, which there was no word for it at the time, taking place right in front of you. So what do? Well, as an officer, you report it to your admiral and ask him to make the decisions. So it was an exceptional case when this officer named, who was a very elite officer, who had already earned the Navy Cross before he even got to a destroyer command, and was obviously on his way up the line, and therefore perhaps Bristol was more wary of him than he was of the other officers. An exceptional circumstance when he actually sort of put his own career on the line and said, you have to protest the Mustafa Kemal. The local officials won't pay attention to you unless you do. And so that was the main thing that happened. Now, they also protested locally, and some of the Americans said that that must have helped persuade the Turks from not doing the kinds of things that happened in Marsavan later at Samsun. Moreover, just having an American ship in or at the harbor with an American officer being there at the time probably dissuaded them for some things. But they were, when the Greek swimmer came and he protested, and the people, he was protesting on the behalf of the men who were from Tekaki, they were not allowed to respond and help him. It was part of their orders.
I know it's the case of the swimmer, of course, but the other question has to do, I realized that the span of the observations start in the
21.
Yeah. And so, is there any observation by the U.S. Navy officers about the participation of Germans, or early participation of Germans in either as traders or as
We found little about the Germans. At this point, I don't know if the Germans have all gone home at this point or not, but there was, at this point, in 1921 to 1922, where this covers, nothing about the Germans. Okay. Yes, please.
I'm wondering if there is any report of a Japanese captain that participated with.
I've been asked about that before, but that was in Smyrna. There was that little two paragraph discussion in Marjorie's book of that, and that's the only one I've seen. I know of. I didn't go. Smyrna was not my major focus, but that's someone I did find it there. Maybe you know more about that.
I can say
Sure.
just a couple of quick words. I tried to chase that story down when I was writing my book, and I didn't do it successfully. But after the book came out, I did find a document, a diary document from Horton, the consul general, who did confirm that there was a Japanese ship in the harbor in Smyrna in early September that did take people aboard. And subsequently, in talking about the book, I've actually met 2 or 3 people whose parents were on that great ship. So I think we can confirm that yes, indeed, at Smyrna there was a Japanese freighter that was an early rescuer of the people of Smyrna. And if I could just add quickly, he's the expert on the Black Sea. I can say that after the destruction of Smyrna and the departure of the Greek army, the American Navy did participate in the evacuation of Greeks along the Pontic seacoast, but definitely beforehand, no, there was none of that.
And there are war diaries to that effect of the American Navy at this port, at that port, the other port. Many of the American commanders at this time had been indoctrinated by the admiral to become pro-Turk, but on the other hand, they were seeing so much terrible things happening before them that they turned their whole viewpoint around. But now, they were still limited by their orders from Admiral Bristol. I wanted to say one more thing. One of the reasons I asked Admiral Stavridis to give us an introduction is, number one, he's got this connection with Asian Minor Greeks, having a grandfather from there, which he has not been hesitant to speak of. He's taking a ship into modern Izmir. He took a ship into modern Izmir as the grandson of somebody whose grandfather's brother had been killed there. But also because I'd like to see the Navy, American Navy, take more cognizance of what has happened. My book, is about the America's Black Sea Fleet, right? But there's not many guns fired. And the audience for the Naval Institute Press and the audience for naval officers is interested mostly in guns being fired, tactics, strategy, if you understand. So Admiral Stavridis is the intellectual of the Navy. He's the, he really is the top man you talk to. He was the head of the Fletcher School of Diplomacy for 3 years after he just got out of the Navy. And he's quoted on television. You may have seen him from time to time. He writes in U.S. News and World Report and so on. He's a very eminent guy, and I hope that the Navy will take more interest in the fact that these were the first guys, Navy guys, to confront genocide themselves in the Navy, and maybe in the military, if you understand. So that's American military. So I think that's another reason I've asked him to do that introduction to see, or forward, to see if we can't get more interest in the topic from them. Well, yes.
Hi. Going through the diaries, I was wondering how detailed are they, and how, if there is any evidence of systematic marches or deaths to do away with all these minorities. Are they?
They're pretty systematic in what they report. Again, they are not first-hand witnesses. They didn't see much of it themselves. But on the other hand, they're reporting this from very reliable people. Even Admiral Bristol at one point says, in a letter that he doesn't broadcast to everybody, I think there's no question that the Turks have taken all the villages and just wiped them out, okay, and marched the people in them. So they're that systematic in the picture you get is of the is very systematic. I guess you'd have to say very, very widespread of what they're seeing. Now they don't report. They only report what is reported to them, but that extends to Biafra or to Marsavan and many other places in them. Yes.
The courageous naval officer who pleaded with Mark Bristol, do we have his name? I didn't catch it.
His name is Arthur, it's in the book, Arthur Leroy Bristol himself, no relation to the Admiral. He became, after this, you remember America at the beginning of World War II began to privately have some convoys between America and Britain, right? It didn't tell anybody about it. He was by this time a vice admiral and headed up those convoys. We would know of him, in my judgment, as much as we would know maybe this is an exaggeration, Halsey and some of the other great Nimitz, because he was on his way up the ladder. He had a heart attack while he was in Newfoundland and died in 1942, I think it was.
How old?
I don't know, 50, I guess,
No
something
family?
like that.
No family?
I don't know. Don't think so. He's great. He was a very, at the time, very respected man, but virtually unknown now.
We can find more information on him from naval records.
I might,
Okay.
if I wanted to.
Because if he has descendants, we're going to find them.
Yeah, that's possible.
Okay.
Take care.
Bob, can I keep you here for just one more moment, and really just for the symposium record, since this will be distributed further for others to watch. Mark Bristol is a crucial character in the story that was unfolding. His naval officers are collecting information. They're sending it to Admiral Bristol, who is the High Commissioner representing the American government in Constantinople. Can you say a little bit about who Mark Bristol was, the kind of person he was, and what he was doing with the information he was receiving to contextualize his decisions and the American actions in Constantinople at the time?
Well, Bristol, again, thought his main job was to promote America and American business. That was partly what he thought his main job was. And whereas he was essentially America's man in Constantinople. Prior man had been the ambassador, what's the earlier? Morgenthau, yeah, that's right. And he was very much on the side of the Armenians and the Greeks. But Bristol was completely opposed to the other side. He was very much on the side of the Turks, partly because of this business of the the business, but also because he didn't like the Greeks as a people somehow. He also had somebody sort of a freelance kind of officer working for him as an intelligence officer who saw some actual Armenian atrocities in the east of Turkey. These are atrocities that, what's the famous, I've lost his name, the famous Armenian historian? The Hovhannissian. Okay, he catalogs what was going on there. And that also got Bristol into deciding that he wouldn't publicize anything. More or less, he kept things under wraps. The terrible stories that came to him, he would not send on to the State Department, whereas other more positive reports about the Turks, he would send on. He had decided that, we have to build up American business. The Turks are going to be in charge. We're going to go with them.